Today we are working on a second gen Tacoma, third gen Tacoma type axle, and this is very similar to a fourth gen 4runner, fifth gen 4runner, also similar to a GX470 FJ Cruiser type vehicle. And what I'm going to be using to remove the bearing is this tool here. If you've watched my last video, I was using it to swap the bearing on an LX470. You can get these from eBay. There is one legitimate seller, the guy that actually designed these and created them, and then there's a bunch of cheap knockoffs. Do yourself a favor, get the American-made one, the one designed by the original person, which is listed username on eBay is Donald the Bonald. Guy's name is Dwayne. Really nice guy, and really should be supporting people that innovate for the Toyota community in general, and he would be that guy. So I'm going to be using a Tacoma type adapter. Now again, this will work for all the models that I just mentioned a moment ago. So a couple of things before we begin. This axle was brought to me with the ABS sensor on. Don't do any press work with this thing on there, okay? You got to make sure to take that off. And then once you do take this off, there's gonna be a little stud left over that the new bearings don't come with. It's a lot easier to remove that stud once you've removed this. So first step, remove this if it's not already been removed. Remove the snap ring, that's very important. And then the next step would be installing this tool over the top, this guy, axle shaft, and then lining everything up. It's a little bit difficult to coordinate this here with my, there we go. All right, so you got that in, but again, we do need to remove that sensor. So if you feel like you can't get this on there properly, just look here, you might find that the sensor's on there. So let me just go ahead and remove the sensor and the snap ring, and we will begin with some press work here. Probably should have used something else here to make this a little quicker, but it's too late, I'm already recording. And actually, it looks like the nut is seized onto the stud, so the stud is coming out with the nut. So, which is okay, that works out. So, got this guy out. Now you can just kind of gently rock this back and forth, and will eventually come out. It's come out. We're going to put these in a safe place out of the way. And next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the snap ring, and it'll be a little difficult to see from that angle there, but I'm going to try my best to. Let's come out. Set that snap ring off to the side. And now you are set to begin with the press work. Okay, so the appropriate adapter tool is on, and I have fastened it with some hardware to the 4 studs that the axle mounts to the axle housing. If you don't happen to have the nuts handy, I went to the hardware store and I was able to pick up some nuts, and the thread on those is M12 by 1 1/4. I did use some M12 washers underneath to support. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slip the tool over and fasten that as well. I'm going to try to make this a little bit of a quicker video, so rather than struggle with one hand, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and begin at the next step, okay? Alright, so I was able to slip this main tool over the axle, and then I was able to line up the tool to the 4 studs from this adapter tool here. And I have already added a washer and a nut to each one of them. These are all hand tight. You don't necessarily need to crank down on them, as long as you kind of get them to where they're hand tight and they can't go anymore. That'll be fine. So next step I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put them on my press here. Okay. Alright guys, so I have the axle set up and well supported on my press. This tool was designed to be used around like a 20-ton Harbor Freight type press. I don't have that. This one's a 30-ton, so this support here is a lot wider. It's too wide to properly support this. If I were to turn it across and support it against this, then this could bend here. So ideally, even on a 20-ton Harbor Freight press, you still want to support it as close to the tube as possible. That way you minimize the chance of this bending. I am going to stop recording here so that I can catch the axle when it drops after it gets pressed out. One thing I want to mention is I placed a piece of wood here. I will be catching the axle, but just in case, you know, if I miss or if it's slippery or anything like that, if it lands on this, then the studs won't get damaged by the concrete. So I'm going to stop recording. One thing I do want to point out beforehand is usually when I do these axles, one of the inner races always gets stuck on the axle shaft. So I'm going to show you a couple different techniques to remove that, and also a very cool tool that Dwayne developed to be able to pull that retainer off, that race off without any cutting. So stand by. I'm going to go ahead and press this out, and I'll show you in just a second what the next step is. So I kind of did want to show you guys the press work here. So what I ended up doing is I put this box over here to kind of provide an additional cushion so that the axle doesn't drop at all. So it's just going to kind of fall onto that box, and the box will support the weight. So I'm going to go ahead and show you press work. And at this point, the axle would have dropped, but because the box is there, it didn't drop at all. So that's actually fully pressed out. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I'll meet you guys on the table. So I've pressed out both axles, and what you see here is the inner race from each one of these bearings that they were pressed out of. It's very common for these to get stuck onto the shaft. As a matter of fact, I've never done one of these axles where it didn't get stuck. Typically, what I've had to do in the past is very carefully cut the retainer, the race, and you do it at an angle, and then you take a wide punch like this once you've cut down far enough, and you put it into your cut line, and then you whack it with a big hammer, and the race will split, and then you can just pull it right off. Problem with that is it's because of the angles, you sometimes don't know how far you're cutting and you might cut into the axle. Fortunately, I've been careful enough that that hasn't happened before, and however, it's very time consuming to do that, and it's annoying. So there are a couple different methods, but I'm going to show you guys the best method for this. Okay, so if you notice, these two here look different, and the reason for that is there is a seal for the bearing that actually gets stuck to the race. Okay, and there's actually another seal down here, and that one we're going to reuse. But the one I'm talking about is this tiny little sheet metal looking one, okay, that is missing from here. And what I did is I took a punch, okay, placed it right there, and then I took a hammer and I went around the perimeter and I knocked it down into this dust shield here. So Dwayne and I kind of bounced some ideas off each other, and what he came up with was this very cool tool that will pull off that retainer with minimal effort and no cutting. One thing I had tried, which will work, and actually, well, I lined it up. I bought this a couple days ago just to see if this bearing separator would go under this part here, and it does. But these edges here are pretty sharp, and there's very minimal engagement on the edge of the retainer. So to really get it to bite, you have to go in a little bit deeper. And I got concerned because I saw these edges begin to make contact with this axle shaft, which means that as I press it out, it's going to drag against this surface and cause some damage. So best thing to do is use this tool, which will now be in development, and you know, again, support a guy who's innovating for the Toyota community and making things easier. So again, you're going to need to push down this little sheet metal seal for the bearing. Not very difficult to do. It'll pop right down, and then we're going to take these retainers off. And again, the press work is very similar to what we did a moment ago, so I'm just going to go ahead and skip that step. And actually, you know what, I'll go ahead and record that as well. Okay. All right, guys, so I have this all set up and ready to press out that inner race using that tool. So I'll go ahead and just begin here. Pretty sure it's come loose already, but because that box is there to catch it, it's not going to show a release. So I'm going to stop here and check, and if it requires more press work, I'm going to keep pressing. And if not, then I'll just, either way, I'll see you guys on the table in a moment. Well, that was pretty exciting. The inner race came out super easily with this tool, and I kind of want to see what it looks like after it's been pressed. So here's the tool, and looks like the tool held up great with no damage or distortion, not bent or anything. So I think this tool is going to be a success for exactly that. So now I'm going to go ahead and do this other axle here. Look how well built that is. Exact measurements, very well supported. Super exciting, guys. This is really cool. Okay, guys, before you proceed, you do have to take into account the pieces that dropped in here. So get some needle nose pliers and just gently lift out the seal, okay? And if you recall, the piece that we were talking about was this one here. That's the piece that needed to get knocked out. And that would have been around this thing here. So again, you can just knock it out with a punch and a hammer, okay? One thing that I did want to mention, because I didn't mention it earlier, is the seal that we pulled out from here, you don't reuse that. That actually is provided on your new bearing. And the way that that sits is it would normally be here on the bearing pocket. But again, we're not going to reuse when you swap the bearing, it's a whole assembly. You don't reuse the housing, you don't reuse the seals. You got to pull everything off. So just go ahead and toss that. All right, so we are going to be working on the backing plate again and replacing the bearing housing, the bearing hub assembly, okay? So we will need to remove this. And again, there were some hardware there, but to kind of speed things up, I had already removed them. So here is the old retainer. This one is well grooved. The owner of this axle, of this vehicle, was not complaining of any leaking. However, when I did inspect the bearings, the bearing grease inside was a little runny and milky. So assuming there was some type of water intrusion at some point, and also possibly some gear oil. Hard to say, but he wasn't leaking out of the housing. Only reason he's swapping these bearings is because he's doing some differential work, and his vehicle has enough miles that he figures he could get ahead and just knock this out while everything's out. So I am replacing these with these here. Okay, same part number for both sides. And what we're going to do is we're going to knock out these studs. And what I like to do is I like to install these nuts over the studs so that we don't damage the threads. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that for all of them. And you want to make sure that when you set these up that you recess the stud so that what takes the impact is the nut, okay, because we are going to be whacking these pretty good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get my hammer, and then we'll start whacking them out. All right, so I'm about to start whacking these out. One thing I forgot to mention was this conical washer. We will need to reuse it, so we're going to set it off to the side. Some tips when knocking these studs out: try to hit as straight down as possible. If you hit at an angle, you could potentially bend the studs and damage them. So excuse me. So just oh, I also put a piece of wood underneath to kind of raise it up and avoid damaging any of the parts of the backing plate that shouldn't get damaged. So go ahead and begin. If I find this difficult to do while recording, I might just stop and resume once I'm done. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stop here because I need to hold the backing plate so it doesn't jump around. All right, so I was able to knock the studs out, and I have already removed the nuts that were kind of protecting them. So then what you do is you just lift this out, and you're going to be just tossing this. Now, the only thing that I want to point out again before you toss out your old bearing assembly is that little stud here. Okay, you got to take that off. And that was the stud, if you recall, for the ABS, sorry, it's out of focus, for the ABS sensor. Okay, so that would need to go back on there with the new sensor. That way you can mount it properly, okay? All right, so we are going to fasten this bearing hub assembly to the backing plate, and we're going to need to do that by pulling these studs through as tight as possible. If you see there is a gap there, which means it's not fully tightened, I just kind of pulled the studs up, tapped them in with a hammer from the back so that they kind of stay in place enough. And then the final part is going to be me tightening these down. I'm going to just use an impact, and I'm going to hold this a little bit here, otherwise it's going to go. And then what we're going to need to do is look in the back here and check for any gaps. And if you see that one there, it's kind of difficult to see. There is a gap, so we need to do that one a little bit more. This one seems to be seated, could use a little bit more. This one here is seated, it looks like, and this one as well. But I'm going to go ahead and give them all a go around. And I'm going to stop recording because that was a little difficult to kind of hold the impact and hold the phone and hold the backing plate at once. So next step is going to be this fully seated, and then we're going to start installing the axle. So here is the final step. Well, not so final. We still need to do the snap ring afterward and reinstall the ABS sensor, but getting close. Here is that conical washer that we are going to be reusing. There is a concave side and a convex side, and the convex side is going up, so cone up. And here's the new retainer we're going to be using. As you can see, there is a tapered side, and the tapered side does go up as well. We're going to be putting the axle shaft through the bottom. Axle shaft will come up this way. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly place it over the shaft, and then I'll have this set up on the press and show you guys what I did to get set up. Okay, so here is the axle, and it's going up this way just like that. Okay, I'm gonna set up my tool on the press, and then I'll show you guys what needs to get done. So I've set my tool up on the press here, and you need this little adapter here. You place that over this little sleeve that's provided with the kit, and this will be the correct diameter to hold that retainer. Otherwise it'll be a little bit cocked on this one here. So you can place the axle everything in here. Everything's going to shift around, so once it's on here, you can go ahead and kind of set everything to where it needs to be. And I'm going to go ahead and put the axle through, and I'll show you guys what I mean. So I've got everything set up for the final press work up the top of the axle, because the axle is not flat up there. I've placed well, the center of the axle has this kind of like a concave shape. So I've placed this over the hub. It's two pieces of plate, and then I'll put this one right in the middle, this round plate. You guys can get creative. I've used spacers before. I've used like a spacer here without the studs, and then I've placed like a flat bar right over it. And or you could just, if you have a flat bar that will clear the studs and be right over this hub here, this hub flange, then you can definitely use that as well. But this is what I have, so that's how I'm doing it. Just trying to give you guys a general idea of what you can do. Next thing, I've greased the shaft so everything slides in nice and smooth. Also clean the shaft. It's important. Make sure you clean off all the residue of the gear oil, and there could be particles or anything like that. So nice and clean. And then just go ahead and line this up, center this to the tool, and then center this to this adapter here, and that'll allow you to clear the spacer. Okay. And that's it. We're going to go ahead and press. I'm going to stop recording here so that I can focus on the press work. And again, I mean, you're just pressing down, and you're going to press down to the limit. And you'll know that you've pressed far enough when you can install the snap ring. If you cannot install the snap ring, you have not pressed down far enough, and you need to continue to do so. So just those are kind of checks and balances that are in place on their own to let you know that you've done the job correctly. Again, if you can put the snap ring on, then that's all you need. Okay, that's all you need. You've done the job correctly. Okay. All right, so I pressed it most of the way in. I wanted to kind of stop there so I could show you guys the final, just so you guys can see how far you can go. Got plenty of space here for the axle to clear. And I'm gonna go ahead and just start pressing. And again, once it stops pressing and you feel significant resistance, that'd be a good time to stop and check and pull everything off. And you know, usually it stops, and then I just give it a quick little pump just to tighten everything up, and then I put the snap ring on. So let's go ahead and do that. So that's it right there. It stopped. I gave it a quick little extra pump. And again, this spacing here, probably not a good gauge. Best to use the spacing for the snap ring. So I'm going to pull everything out and see if the snap ring goes on and see if we need any more press work. I'll meet you guys at the table. Okay, so I didn't record putting the snap ring on just simply because it's difficult to do with one hand. You can open it up here, but then it catches back here. So I got it in, and as you can see, that snap ring moves nice and loosely. That's a good sign that there's proper spacing and that you've pressed this in all the way. So now the last thing that you will need to do is reinstall the ABS sensor. And here's the ABS sensor. You know, I'm gonna go ahead and clean this up. I'll go ahead and stop here, but you're just gonna wanna push that through and tighten that back in there. And that's it. You're done. You just reinstall this into your vehicle. And if you use a good quality bearing, you should have, you know, another 15, 20 years of life, or, you know, 100,000 plus miles that you can go on these bearings. I've seen some of these go 200K, no problem. So either way, this was a good call for the gentleman that owns this axle to replace. I did find signs of liquid intrusion, maybe water or mud or something like that, and also some gear oil in there. So good call on that. And with the new retainer, should have no leaks. Thanks, guys. Actually, before I end the video, I did want to bring up the stud, because one of these came out with the nut seized on the stud, and then one of them I actually had to remove the stud from the old bearing so I could install it on the new one. So there is a longer side and a shorter side, and then a middle part with no threads. The middle part with no threads is what you're going to use to tighten it back onto the bearing housing. So just start threading it in, and hand tighten it, and then just take a slim set of vice grips, and let me tighten my vice grips really quick. And then you just give it a turn, and that's about it. You don't need to really force this one. And then I cleaned up the end of this here, and you just put that in there, and there's a little O-ring that you got to push through, and once it's fully seated, then you can go ahead and add that little 10mm nut back on here, and you will be good to go. And that is the final assembly procedure for this particular set of axles. So Anyway, if you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them, and I'll try to answer as best as I can. Thanks for watching.